The snowstorm struck Pinebridge like a ghost, sudden, silent, and merciless. Thick flakes tumbled sideways in the wind, blurring trees into shapes and sounds into memories. Timberline Pass, already treacherous in the best weather, was now a swirling white corridor of uncertainty. Officer Jack Monroe gripped the wheel of his patrol SUV tighter, guiding the vehicle in low gear through the winding mountain road. His windshield wipers swiped rhythmically, but it did little to cut through the wall of snow. The radio crackled with static, a hollow reminder of how alone he really was out here. Jack wasn't new to danger. At 28, he moved like a man still living in battle. Tall and compact, every movement of his body carried the quiet readiness of a Marine. 4 years in the service had molded his muscles into memory, and 2 years with the Bureau's narcotics division had stripped away the rest, replacing idealism with instinct, trust with vigilance. His short-cropped brown hair was dusted with flakes. His square jaw bore the permanent shadow of stubble. His eyes, steel grey and unreadable, held the weight of someone who had seen more than he'd ever admit. Most mistook that look for detachment. In truth, it was exhaustion that never left. 3 weeks earlier, he'd arrived in Pinebridge without much ceremony. The transfer had come suddenly after a failed operation that no one dared ask about. His personnel file read, "Reassigned. Psychological restabilization recommended." What it didn't say was what Jack couldn't forget. Emily Carter hadn't been just another partner. She was the voice in his earpiece, the one who saw angles he didn't, the only person who understood his silence. They'd been together the night everything went to hell, Pier 17. She went in early to plant surveillance. Her last words had cut off mid-sentence. Her GPS went dark, comms flatlined. Jack, pinned down in a gunfight, had to make the choice, chase a ghost or save the bleeding men beside him. The Bureau marked her as missing, presumed KIA. Just like that, they moved on. Jack didn't. The snow thickened, visibility dropped to barely 30 feet. As he rounded a bend known for black ice, something broke the monotony. A shape, dark. Still, center of the road. He eased onto the brake, and the SUV slid slightly before stopping. Leaning forward, he squinted through the blizzard. It was a dog. A large German shepherd, soaked and shaking, standing motionless in the middle of the road. One hind leg was lifted, trembling from injury. Blood was smeared across its flank. The animal's ribs showed through its matted coat. Yet it didn't cower. It didn't bark. It didn't run. It just stared at him. Ears upright, tail down but not tucked. Amber eyes locked on his with a depth that struck something primal in Jack. It wasn't the look of a stray. It was the look of purpose, of pain restrained by duty. Most people would have honked, swerved, driven past. Jack didn't. He opened the door and stepped into the storm. The wind bit at him immediately. His uniform, though insulated, wasn't built for this cold. Snow lashed across his face, but he didn't stop. He pulled his jacket tighter and approached slowly. "Hey there, bud," he said softly, crouching a few feet away, palms open. "You okay?" The dog didn't move, didn't flinch, just watched. "You're hurt," Jack added. "Let me help." Then, without a sound, the shepherd turned, limped 2 steps, paused, looked back, then moved again, off the road and into the trees. Jack hesitated. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. That dog had waited. For him. The forest beyond the road looked dense and foreboding, shrouded in mist and white. He glanced back at his SUV. The radio hissed. No dispatch, no backup, no witness. His hand rested on his sidearm out of habit. He exhaled once, steadied his nerves, then stepped off the road. Snow crunched under his boots as he followed the dog. The world grew quieter, as if the forest held its breath. The shepherd's limp was pronounced, but it didn't slow. It moved with an urgency that defied pain, driven not by survival, but by intention. The trees thickened around them, tall pines leaning in like silent sentinels. Snow clung to every branch. No trail marked their path, but the dog didn't hesitate. It weaved through the undergrowth, crossed a frozen creek that cracked beneath Jack's weight, and continued climbing. Jack's instincts buzzed. This was too purposeful, too specific. The dog wasn't wandering, it was guiding. And Jack followed. He couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the look in the dog's eyes. Maybe it was the echo of Emily's voice in his memory, whispering from another time. Or maybe it was because Jack had nothing left to lose. 20 minutes passed. Jack's breath fogged in the air. Snow collected on his shoulders. The deeper they went, the more wrong it felt. Not because of the dog, but because of the place. Something about this part of the forest pressed against his chest. A heaviness beyond cold, beyond fear. It was like walking into a story he didn't belong in. Then the terrain sloped. The shepherd climbed a narrow ridge, squeezing between two large rocks. Jack followed, crouching low. They emerged into a shallow ravine, the bottom layered with pine needles and undisturbed snow. The dog stopped near a twisted cedar, sniffed the ground, then began pawing at something hidden beneath snow and debris. Jack hurried forward, dropping to one knee. He brushed away leaves and frost. What emerged sent a jolt down his spine. Black plastic, a casing. He pulled it free. Military-grade locator beacon, covert ops issue, torn strap, scarred surface. On the inside, scratched by wear, were 3 faded letters, E. Carter. Jack froze. His breath caught in his throat. Emily. He hadn't said her name aloud in 6 months, not since her file was closed, not since they shrugged and said no recovery. But here it was. Her gear. The beacon she'd requested weeks before Pier 17. He remembered now how paranoid she'd grown. Don't trust the comms, she had whispered, and don't trust Reynolds. Reynolds. The golden boy. Slick, polished, untouchable. Emily had never trusted him. Maybe she was right. Jack stared at the beacon, his gloved fingers trembling slightly. The shepherd sat beside him, panting quietly, blood still oozing from its injured leg. Jack gently touched the dog's side. You brought me here. Didn't you? No bark, no reaction, just the solemn stillness of a creature that had waited long enough. Jack looked around. No footprints, no signs of anyone else. But the beacon hadn't been here long, not yet buried. He reached for his radio. Static. Nothing. He sighed. They were too deep for signal. He would have to hike back. But something inside him didn't want to leave. Not yet, not without answers. He slipped the beacon into his coat, turned to the dog. Let's get you some help. Then we figure this out. The shepherd didn't move, just watched him. And Jack understood. This wasn't over, not even close. Jack moved through the forest with deliberate care, each step sinking into the thick carpet of snow. The cold gnawed at his skin, crept through the seams of his boots and tightened his breath with every inhale. But he didn't stop. Ahead, the wounded German shepherd, still limping, still silent, pushed forward with a kind of quiet urgency that defied pain. His gait was uneven, his rear leg dragging slightly, but his pace never faltered. He had somewhere to go, and he wanted Jack to follow. The pines around them stood tall and old, their limbs weighed down by heavy snow. The storm had softened the world to a hush, as though the forest itself was watching, waiting. No trail marked their passage. No footprints guided the way. But the dog moved with unwavering instinct, weaving between trees, climbing small rises and crossing icy patches as if retracing steps he had taken before. Jack scanned the surroundings with trained eyes. He had patrolled streets riddled with danger, crossed deserts where silence was a weapon, and moved through cities where every shadow could hold a threat. But this forest felt different. Not overtly hostile, but ancient, layered. The kind of quiet that wasn't just silence. It was absence. As if something had once lived here and was long since gone, or worse, still here unseen. He glanced again at the dog's back. Every few yards the shepherd would pause and look back, ears twitching, amber eyes glowing faintly in the white haze. There was intelligence there, more than obedience. It wasn't the focus of a dog trained to sit, fetch, or bark on command. It was deeper, older. This dog had been someone's partner, someone's shadow. Not a tool, but a fellow soldier. Jack had worked with dogs like that during his time with the Bureau's elite narcotics unit. Canines that could read a room before a human could. That sensed tension, anticipated violence, and responded to fear not with panic, but with quiet presence. This one had all those signs and more. He remembered the way the shepherd had stood in the road, bleeding but calm, the way it had waited, as if it knew Jack would stop, would follow, would care. That wasn't chance. They passed over a frozen creek, the ice groaning faintly beneath Jack's weight. He took it slow, following the dog's smaller, surer path. The storm raged less now, but snow still fell, lighter and drier, like ash drifting from the sky. After nearly 20 minutes, they crested a small ridge. Beyond it, the ground dipped into a narrow channel between two large boulders, a natural cut in the terrain, lined with pine needles and rimmed by black ice. The dog descended first, limping but determined. Jack followed, heart hammering louder than the wind. The dog stopped near a gnarled cedar tree and began pawing at something half buried beneath the snow. Jack quickened his pace, boots crunching. He dropped to a crouch beside the dog and began brushing away snow and damp leaves. His gloved fingers struck something solid, plastic, smooth and cold. He pulled it free, and the breath caught in his chest. It was a covert ops locator beacon, military grade, standard issue for deep cover agents. The casing was scratched, its strap torn as if it had been ripped off in a struggle, and on the inside, etched faintly, worn by friction, were 3 letters, E. Carter. Jack's pulse surged. Emily. He stared at the beacon, frozen. His breath fogged the air. He turned it over slowly, brushing off frost, dust and disbelief. It couldn't be. Not here. Not now. Not after everything. He hadn't said her name out loud in half a year. Not since that night at Pier 17. Not since the Bureau closed her case with a one-line report and a nod that said move on. But this wasn't over. This wasn't over at all. The dog sat beside him, panting lightly, its breath creating small clouds that vanished into the cold. Blood trickled slowly from its leg, staining the snow crimson. It made no sound, only watched him, unwavering. "You brought me here, didn't you?" Jack murmured. The dog didn't blink. Jack rose and scanned the area. No fresh footprints, no drag marks, nothing but the storm's residue and silence. But the beacon wasn't old. It hadn't been here long. Someone, maybe Emily, had left it. Maybe recently. He reached for his radio, pressed the button. Static. The signal was garbage out here. His mind turned back to the last time he'd seen Emily. The briefing, the night before the raid. She'd whispered something then. Don't trust the comms, and don't trust Reynolds. Jack had brushed it off, too focused, too confident, too blind. Warren Reynolds, mid-40s, silver hair, pressed suits, smooth voice, politically polished. Everything about him screamed control. Emily had hated him, said he moved cases too fast, chased headlines and played favourites, said he cut corners that got people hurt. Jack hadn't believed her. Now, standing in the snow with her beacon in hand, doubt crept in like frost beneath his collar. He looked down at the dog again. It stared back with that same steady, impossible gaze. He saw it now. This wasn't just any K9. This dog had belonged to someone, trained in ways that weren't just tactical, but emotional. Loyal beyond command. The thought hit him like a wave. What if this wasn't just a survivor? What if this was Emily's dog? His eyes widened as pieces fell into place, the look, the intelligence, the fact that it had waited for him, led him to this. He reached out and rested a hand on the dog's shoulder. The animal didn't flinch. "We're not done, are we?" Jack whispered. Snow collected on his coat. The trees above creaked in the cold. He glanced once more at the beacon, now inside his jacket. This wasn't evidence. This was a message, a clue, and maybe a call for help. He stood, brushing snow from his knees, and looked into the forest from where they had come. He'd have to head back, get the dog help, recharge the radio, then come back with more than just faith. As he turned, the dog slowly rose beside him, limping still but standing tall. Together they began the slow climb back toward the road. Behind them, the snow began to fall harder once more. But Jack didn't care. Something had changed. This wasn't a cold trail anymore. It was alive, and Jack Monroe was going to follow it, no matter where it led. Back in the dim quiet of his small rental house on the edge of Pinebridge, Jack Monroe sat hunched over a dining table cluttered with dirt, snowmelt, and something far heavier, answers. The damaged locator beacon marked E. Carter lay in the center, its black casing chipped, the internal circuitry scorched from an intentional blow. Jack's hands, still damp from cleaning Shadow's leg, trembled slightly as he turned the device over and over, trying to process the truth it represented. The house smelled like pine needles, cold metal and dog fur. The shepherd, now bandaged and curled near the foot of the bed, rested with slow, shallow breaths. Jack had cleaned the leg wound using supplies from his patrol truck, gauze, disinfectant, strips of torn flannel. The dog hadn't resisted. He simply watched Jack with amber eyes, the same eyes that had once stared through a snowstorm and asked for help without making a sound. Jack leaned back and stared at the beacon again. It hadn't been discarded in the woods accidentally. Someone had smashed it deliberately. The battery was gone. The wires were gutted. Whoever left it out there wanted it to vanish without trace. But they hadn't counted on Shadow. They hadn't expected the dog to survive, to wait, to lead someone back. and they hadn't counted on Jack. He stood and moved to the bookshelf tucked into the corner of the small room. From between two field manuals, he pulled out a battered black binder labelled Operation Rainfall. It was all he had left from Pier 17. Most of the Bureau's case files had been redacted or locked away after Emily's disappearance, but Jack had kept what he could. Maps, photos, handwritten notes, evidence of a mission that had gone sideways and the partner they'd lost along the way. He laid the contents out carefully. A terrain map of the drop site, an old floor plan of the warehouse, scribbled annotations in Emily's tight, deliberate handwriting. He smoothed the map flat under the lamp, running his finger along the margins. Then he saw it, nearly invisible beneath a crease, a thin red line drawn in pen. It branched off the printed trail, leading northwest, away from the known perimeter. At the end of the line was a small handwritten mark, an X beside the words Old Bunker, Northridge. Jack's heart skipped. Northridge. He hadn't heard that name since his academy years. A remote stretch of wilderness north of Pine Bridge, once used for Cold War military exercises. Shelters had been built there, camouflaged bunkers reinforced and buried beneath the earth. Some had been sealed and mapped. Others had disappeared from record entirely. Forgotten. Not to Emily. Jack grabbed his phone and snapped a photo of the map. Then he carefully folded it and slid it into his coat pocket. Behind him, Shadow let out a low, twitching whimper in his sleep. Jack turned, watching as the dog's legs stirred, his body caught in a dream that sounded like fear. He knelt beside him. "You're safe," he whispered. Shadow blinked groggily, then slowly looked up. Jack ran a hand gently down his side. The dog didn't flinch, didn't move away. He simply leaned into the contact. It was real, all of it. Jack returned to the table, studying the beacon one last time before sliding it into a zippered pouch. There wasn't much more to analyze here. The real answer lay in Northridge. If Emily had marked that spot, if she had gone there, then he would too. The next morning, the snow had slowed but not stopped. Jack stood outside the sheriff's office, his breath fogging the air as he sipped lukewarm coffee from a thermos. His uniform was crisp but dusted with frost, his boots wet from the morning walk. In his other hand, he clutched a folder. Inside were photos of the beacon, the red-marked map, and a grainy picture of Emily Carter standing beside a younger, alert version of the dog now curled up in Jack's home. He pushed through the glass doors. The office buzzed with the slow rhythm of rural law enforcement. Dispatchers at their stations, officers reviewing paperwork. A young deputy named Rachel Deeks offered him a smile. She was new, barely 26, and still carried the kind of optimism that hadn't yet been worn thin by loss. Jack returned the gesture, albeit faintly. In the back sat Acting Chief Sarah Breen, broad-shouldered, grey-streaked, practical to the bone. Her sweater sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and her eyes were narrowed behind reading glasses as she passed through case logs. Jack approached, set the folder down in front of her. "Chief," he said, voice even, "I need your approval for a one-day search. Northridge sector. No backup, just me. Sarah didn't look up. That area's restricted, Monroe. Unless you've got a missing persons report or a pinged signal, I can't approve it." He tapped the folder. She flipped it open, her brow furrowed. The beacon, the map, the photo. "This is from a closed case. It's not closed to me," Jack said. "And that dog? He didn't lead me to trash. He led me to her beacon." Sarah leaned back slowly, removed her glasses. "You come with baggage, Monroe. Your file's thick enough to stop a bullet. I've already taken heat for hiring you." "I'm not asking for a convoy," he replied. "I'm telling you, I'm going, with or without your signature." The office fell silent. Rachel looked up from her desk, sensing the tension, but saying nothing. Sarah stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. "You get hurt, I can't cover you. You disappear, it's on you. And if you find nothing," Jack's jaw tensed, "then at least I'll know." She didn't sign anything. But she didn't stop him either. 2 hours later, Jack and Shadow moved through knee-deep snow into the wilderness north of town. The dog, now outfitted with a reinforced harness and side pouch for gauze, limped slightly but refused to slow. His eyes were focused, his steps deliberate. The leg wound was healing, but the drive in him hadn't dimmed. Jack followed the hand-drawn map closely, matching ridges to landmarks, stream beds to thin curves of ink. The terrain was harsh and unfamiliar. Trails had long since vanished beneath ice and undergrowth. Silence pressed in from all sides. The only sounds were the crunch of their boots and the whisper of wind threading through trees. Hours passed. They reached a clearing. The shape of the land matched the red X on Emily's map. Crescent ridge, a frozen stream, a slope of soft powder undisturbed by tracks. Jack paused to catch his breath. Shadow circled, nose twitching, tail stiff. Then, suddenly, he froze. His snout lowered to a snow-covered mound near a crooked pine. He began to dig. Jack dropped beside him, shoveling snow with his gloved hands. Metal clanged beneath. They uncovered a square steel hatch, rusted around the edges, partially buried in frost. A heavy padlock had once sealed it, but the lock was broken. Jack gripped the handle, hesitated, then pulled. The hatch groaned, reluctant. A cold wind exhaled from the dark beneath. The air smelled of rust, of rot, of blood. Jack clicked on his flashlight and descended into the dark. The metal rungs of the ladder were slick with ice, and Jack's boots clanged as he descended into the bunker's hollow belly. The light from his flashlight flickered across the cinder-block walls, revealing a crude, hastily abandoned shelter. The temperature dropped sharply below ground, the kind of cold that didn't just sting skin, it felt invasive, like it seeped into the marrow of your bones. The beam of light caught on broken fixtures hanging from exposed wires, a rusted chair lying on its side, and a bent metal shelf half collapsed in the corner. Jack stepped cautiously, scanning every inch. The floor was covered in a thin film of dirt and dried leaves, scattered debris that spoke of recent movement, not long-term decay. But what stopped him cold was what lay just beyond the ladder, a patch of black fabric. He crouched, lifted it. A torn badge. Emily's. The edges were frayed, the surface dirty, but her unit's emblem was still faintly visible beneath the grime. Nearby, an empty medical syringe lay discarded, its cap missing as if dropped mid-struggle. And across the far wall, a dark smear of dried blood stained into the cinder blocks like a silent scream. She had been here. Jack didn't need confirmation. He could feel it. This wasn't just a supply cache or old drill shelter. It had been used, recently and violently. Shadow remained at the entrance above, as if letting out a low whimper but refusing to climb down. Jack didn't blame him. The air stank of old pain and something else, something coppery and sour, like fear made tangible. He pocketed the badge and did one final sweep, then climbed back into the snow. As he emerged into the pale light, Shadow pressed into him, tail low, body trembling. Jack whispered, "She was here." And the dog, as if already knowing, leaned harder into his side. They stepped away from the hatch, Jack's breath sharp in his throat. The evidence, the badge, the blood, the camera lens embedded in a tree stump nearby, all painted a picture darker than he'd anticipated. A trap, not a tomb. Someone had been watching. The signal jamming hadn't been accidental. Someone was still out there. He raised his portable radio. "Unit 12 to base," he called, requesting immediate response, coordinates to follow, possible recovery site. Static. He tried again, flipping frequencies. Still nothing. He turned slowly, heart thudding. Every instinct he'd honed in combat told him the truth. He was not alone. Shadow stood rigid, nose to the wind, muscles coiled. Then a low growl, deep guttural, rose from the dog's throat. A shot cracked through the silence. Jack dove behind a tree just as Shadow lunged, intercepting the bullet meant for him. The dog collapsed with a sharp cry, blood spreading quickly into the snow. Jack didn't have time to think. He fired blindly toward the ridge, forcing the shooter to retreat, then threw himself toward Shadow, dragging the dog behind a downed log for cover. His breath came hard and fast, hands soaked in blood as he wrapped his scarf tightly around the dog's shoulder. "Stay with me," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper, cracking at the edges. Shadow whimpered but stayed conscious. Jack's thoughts surged. The memory of Emily's last words. The warning about Reynolds. 6 months earlier, behind a closed door in Denver, she'd told the senior officers, "We may have a breach, a high-level one." Reynolds had smiled, too smoothly, and answered, "Those are serious accusations, Carter. You should be careful where you aim them." She'd stared back. "Then help me aim them right." That had been the last time she was seen. Now Jack knew she hadn't just gone missing. She'd been silenced, and they'd tried to silence him too. He looked down at Shadow, whose breathing was rapid and shallow. They couldn't stay here. Not exposed, not wounded. He had to move. With one arm, Jack lifted the dog, cradling him close despite the weight. Blood soaked through the scarf, warm against his chest. He turned west, away from the hatch, deeper into the woods. The only priority now was distance. The terrain sloped uphill. Snow clung to his coat, his breath ragged with exertion. Every footfall was a fight against fatigue. But Jack didn't stop. He found a narrow overhang carved into a ridge, a shallow cave, more of a hollow than a shelter, but it would have to do. He laid Shadow down gently, wrapping him in the coat he'd taken from the patrol truck. He packed snow around the wound, trying to slow the bleeding again. The dog trembled, whined once, then grew still. "You're still here," Jack murmured. "Stay with me a little longer." Then, a sound, faint. Jack froze, ears straining. The wind howled through the trees, but he heard it again. A voice. Help. His pulse spiked. He stepped to the cave's edge, flashlight raised. There, in the distance, another sound. A whisper, weak, desperate. He glanced once at Shadow, then took off, feet barely touching the snow. He moved fast, ignoring the pain in his knees, the fear in his chest. The voice led him downhill through trees and over ice-slicked ground until he found it. A steel grate. Narrow, hidden beneath snow and branches. Different from the hatch. This wasn't for storage. It was for containment. He dropped to his knees and cleared it. "Emily?" he whispered. "Emily, is that you?" A cough. Then a voice, hoarse, weak. "Jack!" He yanked the grate. It didn't budge. He grabbed a branch, jammed it beneath the edge, leveraged all his weight. With a shriek of metal, the cover gave way. He climbed down without hesitation. The room was small, concrete walls, a cot, a rust-stained bucket, shackles bolted to the floor. One flickering bulb cast a sickly glow, and in the corner, collapsed but alive, was Emily Carter. She was thinner, her skin pale and bruised, hair tangled and dry, but her eyes, though sunken, still held the fire Jack remembered. "You came," she rasped. He dropped to his knees beside her. "You're alive." She gave a faint smile. "Barely." He inspected her wrists, one shackle broken, the other rusted through. He snapped it loose. "Who did this?" She coughed hard, wincing. "Reynolds, he runs it all." Jack froze. "He wasn't just leaking intel," she said. "He built the pipeline. Drugs, weapons, using us to clean up the raids while the real stuff got funneled through his contacts." "You found out?" "I got too close," she nodded. "Logged everything. Names, times, drop points. Hid it in my boot. They took everything else, but not that." With trembling fingers, she reached under the cot, into a crack in the floor, and pulled free a small leather notebook. Water-stained, worn. Intact. Jack flipped through it. Pages covered in codes, maps, initials. Years of work. Evidence. "They thought I was dead," she whispered, "but Reynolds, he wanted to be sure." He closed the notebook, clenched his jaw. "We're getting out." She shook her head. "Wait, where's Shadow?" Jack hesitated. "Alive. Hurt." Tears pooled in her eyes. "He stayed all this time?" Jack nodded. "He never left." He helped her stand, an arm around her trembling frame. Step by agonizing step, they climbed the ladder, returning to the surface just as the light began to dim again. In the cave, Shadow stirred weakly. Emily dropped beside him, stroking his ears. "I knew you'd keep watch," she whispered. "Good boy." And in that fragile silence between wind and trees, Jack felt something in him shift. They were no longer looking for hope. They'd found it. The wind screamed through the trees as Jack pushed forward, Emily leaning weakly against his side and Shadow limping ahead of them through the snow. The darkness pressed in from all directions, so thick it felt alive. The cold no longer bit. It crushed, seeping through layers of fabric and flesh, testing their resolve with every passing second. Jack's boots slipped on frozen roots, his breath sharp and uneven, and his arms ached from holding Emily's fragile weight. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. She was alive, and now that he had her, he was not letting go. Emily's head rested against his chest, her eyes closed, but her fingers still clutched the small leather-bound notebook against her ribs like it contained her last breath. Shadow stayed just ahead, occasionally glancing back, his shoulder bleeding anew from the strain, droplets of red staining the snow like breadcrumbs. But he pressed on, protecting, leading. Every sound in the forest carried meaning, the groan of trees, the hush of falling snow, the far-off crack of branches bending in the wind. Jack knew they didn't have long. Whoever had shot Shadow was still out there. And if they realized Emily had escaped, they would come again, angrier, better armed, more desperate. Jack had seen men like that, men with power slipping through their fingers. They always came back. But now he had the truth. The notebook, the badge, the bunker, Everything Reynolds had tried to bury was in Jack's hands and, more importantly, in Emily's memory. It wasn't just a breach, it was a full-scale conspiracy, a pipeline of drugs and weapons that threaded through the Bureau's own operations, cleansed by official raids, then redirected into the black market, and Reynolds had orchestrated it all. Jack's grip on Emily tightened. His voice was barely a whisper. "Almost there." Emily stirred. "Is he still ahead?" "Yeah," Jack said. "He hasn't looked back in miles." She smiled faintly. "Still protecting me." Jack's throat clenched. The snow deepened as they approached the edge of the woods. The pines thinned, and the ground opened into a clearing blanketed in untouched white. Timberline Pass loomed nearby, less than half a mile from the old ranger station. Jack recognized the slope, the gentle dip in the earth. It was familiar ground. Then, light. A sudden burst, bright and blinding, slicing through the dark from above. Jack froze, shielding Emily with his body. Another flash. Then a low, growing rumble. A helicopter. Not military. Not Reynolds' men. Rescue. Jack dropped to his knees, waving one arm, flashlight beam blinking in the dark. Emily lifted her head, eyes fluttering open, hope flickering across her face. Shadow barked once, short, sharp, and then collapsed again in the snow. The chopper circled once, then descended. Its rotors whipped the trees into a frenzy, snow swirling like ash in a storm. A side hatch opened and two figures dropped from the cabin, both in winter tactical gear, harnesses clipped to ropes. The first to reach them was a woman in her 30s, sturdy build, braided dark hair and sharp eyes that scanned the scene in seconds. "You Jack Monroe?" she yelled over the roar. He nodded, cradling Emily. "Two victims, one injured, one barely walking." Her gaze swept from Emily to Shadow. "We've got them," she said, signaling behind her. Her name tag read Officer Marissa Kent. The second rescuer, Danny Ruiz, thin, bearded, quick, moved to take Emily from Jack's arms. She resisted for a moment, fingers clinging to the notebook, but Jack helped ease her into Ruiz's hold. Kent knelt beside Shadow. "This dog took a bullet?" she asked, assessing the wound. "He saved both of us," Jack said, voice hoarse. She looked at the shepherd, then back at Jack. "Then he rides with us." Within minutes, they were airborne. Jack sat beside Emily and Shadow, his coat wrapped around her shoulders, his hand beneath hers, beneath the blanket. Her grip was weak, but it didn't let go. Below them, the forest shrank into dark green and white patches, the trees no longer looming, but distant. The danger was behind them now. For the first time in days, Jack allowed himself to breathe. When they landed at Pinebridge Regional, the hospital exterior was a controlled storm of uniforms, headlights and motion, FBI vehicles, local cruisers, suits and badges and noise. Everything Jack had once been part of and now viewed through new, sharpened eyes. He helped Emily out of the helicopter. The notebook never left her hands. Over the next 12 hours, the world unfolded. Interrogations, statements, signed affidavits. Emily's testimony spilled like ice cracking beneath weight, cold, sharp, unstoppable. Names, locations, operation times, coded references. Every detail lined up, and the notebook backed her up. Handwriting, maps, markings, proof. By dusk, the warrant was signed. Warren Reynolds was arrested at his office in the Bureau's State Division headquarters. 3 agents and a logistics manager were taken with him. The news exploded across headlines: conspiracy, corruption, treason. But Jack didn't care about the headlines. For him, it was closure. 3 days later, Jack stood outside the animal clinic in town. The wind lighter now, spring just beginning to push winter back from the rooftops. Through the window, he could see Shadow lying on a padded bed, an IV in his front leg, a thick bandage over his shoulder. His eyes were closed, but his chest rose and fell steadily. Beside Jack, in the passenger seat of his truck, Emily sat bundled in a thick coat, watching through the glass. "They say he'll walk again," she murmured. Jack nodded. "He'll run again." The door creaked open. Chief Sarah Breen approached, her grey coat buttoned high, scarf tucked neatly beneath her chin. In her gloved hand she carried a manila envelope. She handed it to Jack without expression. Commendation paperwork, Medal of Valor, special field recognition, full reinstatement. Jack looked at the envelope, then at her. "I don't want it." She raised one brow. "Then what do you want?" Jack exhaled. "A quiet job, Pinebridge PD and a dog to come home to." Sarah studied him for a moment, then gave a small approving nod. "That we can do." Spring came early that year, and everything Jack thought he'd lost had somehow found its way back. The snow had long melted from the rooftops, revealing shingles that hadn't seen sunlight in months. Pine trees swayed gently in the breeze, their green needles glistening under the soft kiss of early spring. In the heart of Pinebridge, nestled where an abandoned ranger station once stood, a new structure had taken root. Modest in size, built with polished stone, timber and wide glass panes that welcomed the sun, it stood as a quiet monument to survival. They called it Shadow Sanctuary. 2 wings, shaped like open arms, stretched outward from a central courtyard. One wing housed a therapy centre, quiet rooms, padded floors, soft lights and spaces for healing words. The other was for canine rehabilitation, a haven for dogs who had, like their humans, seen too much and carried what couldn't be spoken. Inside the main courtyard, laughter echoed, children running between murals of dogs painted across the walls. One, larger than the rest, showed a German shepherd resting under a tree, his body relaxed, his eyes watchful. The real Shadow lay not far from the mural, curled on a thick blanket beneath a wooden sign carved with his name. Now 8 years old, his coat had regained its sheen, though the scar on his shoulder, where the bullet had passed through, remained visible beneath the fur. His eyes were calm, alert, and when children approached, they did so quietly, as if instinctively understanding that this dog had seen things they couldn't name. One of those children was Ava. She was 9, small, pale, with wispy blonde hair and a blue sweater 2 sizes too big. She had come to the centre 6 weeks ago, placed in the care of her aunt after being removed from a home marked by shadows of its own. Ava hadn't spoken a full sentence in years. Trauma had frozen something inside her, had taken her voice and wrapped it in fear. But Shadow hadn't asked her to talk. Each day she would sit beside him, sometimes drawing, sometimes crying into his fur. He never moved, never flinched, just breathed. And today, as the townsfolk gathered to celebrate the centre's grand opening, Ava leaned closer to the dog, brushed her fingers softly across his back and whispered, so faintly the breeze nearly carried it away, "I'm not scared anymore." Emily stood nearby, arms crossed, a soft smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Her recovery hadn't been fast, but it had been complete. The weight she'd lost in captivity had returned. Her strength had come back. Her hair was shorter now, a decision part practical, part symbolic. Each inch shed was a piece of pain released. She wore a blue fleece vest embroidered with her title, Second Shadow Program Director. Beside her stood Jack, no longer haunted, no longer lost. His uniform still bore the Pinebridge PD badge, but he wore it differently now. His shoulders no longer carried the burden of failure. They carried purpose. He had chosen to stay, chosen to rebuild, chosen not to run from the snow, but to walk through it. The townspeople filled the courtyard, veterans, children, retirees, each face marked in their own way by hardship, but softened by something else, belonging. They brought warm casseroles, handmade collars, bags of dog food, and folding chairs. Dogs of all breeds trotted beside them, tails wagging in slow, easy arcs. Chief Sarah Breen arrived last, as always. Her grey coat was spotless, her steel bun tighter than usual. She carried a stack of small wooden plaques and laid them carefully on the front table. She said nothing, but when she passed Jack, she gave him a single nod, the kind of nod that meant things had come full circle. Emily stepped to the podium. The crowd grew quiet. "I never thought I'd stand in front of people again," she began. Her voice, though soft, carried. "And I certainly never thought the one who'd bring me back would have 4 legs and more patience than I ever deserved." A ripple of warm laughter spread through the audience. She continued, "This place was built for those who've walked through fire. But not just the people, the dogs too. Every canine who comes through these doors carries a story, a scar, a journey, and we won't ask them for anything, except to stay beside those who need them." She stepped back. Jack took her place, holding a small pair of scissors for the ribbon cutting. He glanced down at Shadow, lying nearby, who lifted his head just slightly at the sound of his voice. "You know," Jack began, "I used to think dogs were just trained tools, meant to follow commands. Sit, stay, fetch, obey." He paused, letting the silence fill in the rest. "But Shadow, he didn't follow orders. He followed a bond. He didn't quit when he was wounded. He didn't run when things got dark. He stayed. And if he's taught us anything, it's this. Healing doesn't always come loud. Sometimes it arrives quietly, nose first, with a heartbeat beside you in the dark." He cut the ribbon. Applause followed, not roaring but soft and sustained, like rain tapping on windows, like something too important for noise. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, families began to drift home. Children said goodbye to dogs with lingering hugs. The wind stirred the trees, but it no longer howled. It whispered. Jack sat beneath the tree beside Shadow. Emily joined him, a cup of cocoa in hand. "Did you ever think it would end like this?" she asked, her voice quiet. Jack looked out across the sanctuary, toward the trails, the therapy rooms, the flower garden beginning to bloom. "No," he said honestly, "but I'm glad it did." Shadow rested his head on Jack's boot. His tail gave a soft, single thump. Emily smiled. "So what's next?" Jack shrugged. "Tomorrow we're training with a new rescue, golden retriever. Name's Finn, loves chewing on boots." Emily chuckled. "He'll fit right in." As the last light of day painted the trees gold, the wind passed through the branches one more time, not as a warning but as a reminder. A voice from the past saying, "You're home now. We don't choose where our stories begin. But we do get to choose who walks beside us as they continue." Shadow wasn't just a dog. He was memory that refused to fade, a heartbeat that stayed behind when everything else had been lost. He didn't just survive, he waited. And in doing so, he built something more than a shelter. He built a home. In the eyes of a frightened child, in the hand of a trembling veteran, in the silence shared between two people who refused to let go. Maybe in our own lives, the pain we carry isn't always visible. Maybe healing begins not with grand gestures, but with quiet presence, showing up, sitting close, waiting in the snow until someone is ready to walk again. If this story found you when you needed it most, share it. You are not alone. Somewhere out there, just like Shadow, someone is waiting to walk with you.